So welcome back to our second installment of electricity generation training. And today we're going to be focusing on capacity versus energy, along with some key differences between dispatchable resources and intermittent resources. And so Colin and Andrew, welcome back. In our last session, both of you stated that shifting to an all renewable resource was not the responsible thing to do. And I want to dig into that a little bit deeper today to help our audience better understand why a renewable future is not the responsible path for the near term. Let's start with the definition of capacity and energy. Residential electricity users may not be familiar with the concept of demand since their bills come in kilowatt hour usages. But commercial and industrial users will definitely be familiar with demand because that's part of their billing component. So it's explaining the difference between capacity and energy is really difficult. Andrew, Colin, and I have been debating that for the last few days. How do we explain this concept? And Colin rightfully challenged me because I like to use the analogy of capacity being like pressure in a hose. But that only tells part of the story because there's more to it than that. So while capacity can be analogous to that, it's probably more like a water tower. So it's got something behind it. It's got water in it as well as the pressure. And so our power plants can be like those water towers dispersed through the system. But the missing component was time. I didn't realize that. I had to go back to my electrical engineering roots, to how you define power and then how you define energy. But time is the real difference. So for electric systems, you have capacity, which is measured in megawatts or thousands of kilowatts, and energy is measured in kilowatt hours. And so with that understanding, let's first talk about the capacity of the AECC fleet. And so, Colin, would you give us an overview of the capacity that AECC has access to?
Yeah, and if I can, I would just add one comment to the capacity versus energy discussion here a little bit. I think of capacity as the potential for us to produce energy, right? And so, as you mentioned, megawatts. And then I think of the energy component of it as the actual electricity produced. And as you mentioned, therefore, a time component is associated with that because it is a rate.
Right.
And if we're using the analogy of water still, it's similar to the flow rate of gallons per hour. So we've got kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, and so forth. And so I think sometimes to think about capacity as our potential is a good way to think about it.
Perfect.
When it comes to AECC's potential, their capacity, right? As we mentioned in our previous discussion, we have a fairly diversified portfolio of generation resources that make up our capacity, most of which is on the gas side. So we have about 1,900 megawatts of gas-fired power plant capacity. We have about 1,500 megawatts of coal-fired power plant capacity. And then we move to our renewables, where we have about 500 megawatts of wind generation capacity and 350 megawatts of hydroelectric capacity. That all rounds out in round even numbers to about 4,250 megawatts. And we'll add solar to that renewable mix here pretty soon, as we've got one project that's being commissioned. We'll add about 120 megawatts later this year of solar capacity, which will bring AECC just shy of 4,400 megawatts.
4,400 megawatts. That's a lot of capacity. And I know that even just here recently with Storm Jerry, our all-time peak load is in that 3,100 megawatt range. And so why so much extra capacity?
First of all, let me just talk about the numbers that we had with our peak demand. You just mentioned Winter Storm Jerry. So yeah, it was above 3,100. The only other time in our history where it was above 3,100 was during Winter Storm Elliott. So that was right before Christmas 2022, a really, really cold spell. So, first of all, I'm pointing out that our peaks have occurred in the winter. We also have high peaks in the summer, but not nearly as high as what we've had with the winter peak. So our all-time summer peak occurred in July, and that was a little bit above 2,600. So we're talking about our winter peak being
even a bigger difference,
20% higher than what our summer peak is. So why do we need 4,000 megawatts or more? I guess 4,250. You included in that number our wind and the solar. Well, the wind isn't going to be there in the summer when we need it. The wind almost, you can get it spring and fall, wind's really good. Even during the day, usually it comes at night instead of during the daylight hours. So, but it's particularly low during summer peak conditions. The 5 to 6 p.m. Summertime is when we would be peaking on our system. Now in the winter, wind does pretty good, but solar, when are we peaking in the winter? It's the 7 to 8 a.m. in the morning. So the sun is not going to be there in the coldest winter morning hours when we're actually having the highest demands on our system. Even beyond the wind and the solar and the issues with them, we can't really count on every plant to be there 24/7. There's outages, unplanned and planned. So you have to have a little bit of an extra there for those outages as well.
Yeah, I kind of think about a car. I mean, if you think about driving on a long trip, you got to stop and get gas, and you got other problems that may break it down. So even for something that's very reliable, you have to have some extra capacity. So that makes sense. We have to have extra capacity on the system to account for when plants break down or they're in outage. We have to account for the intermittency of wind and solar. So in other words, there are times, going back to that time component that we talked about, when the resource may not be available to provide capacity or energy into the system. So let's go back to the statement you both made that all renewables wouldn't be a responsible thing for us to do. So if AECC had 4,250 or soon to be 4,400 megawatts of just solar and wind, and we'll throw in batteries. We'll go ahead and throw batteries in the mix to meet our load. What issues would you expect?
First of all, if you have that potential, we'll call it that capacity, and it's all in renewables, Andrew really alluded to the fact that the renewables aren't there all hours of all days. When the sun goes down or the wind isn't blowing, we wouldn't have that available capacity, that energy. And so that would move us potentially to market purchases, right? And so there's a cost impact potentially associated there. We would have to buy, if it was available, we'd have to buy that energy for our member owners. So there's a big cost impact to that.
And not only are you purchasing energy, but you're having to purchase capacity. We have obligations to have a certain amount of capacity. 4,000 megawatts of solar and wind, that's not the way they're accredited. Solar is accredited minimal, if any, in the winter. And even wind is accredited maybe 10 to 20% of its installed capacity.
So I want, because I knew that was going to come out, and I want to pick on that a little bit just to give our audience an understanding of what that would mean. And so if it was credited at 10% of the capacity, and we've got to have enough capacity to cover our load, and we've got a 3,000 megawatt load, we would have to install 30,000
exactly
megawatts of that resource to meet our load.
That's right.
And so not only is it not there when you need it, so there's additional cost of backing that up, buying off the market, but just the installed cost. You install 10 times what you need in order to get a resource that even then wouldn't be available at the times that you mentioned.
And I mentioned the market purchases. Of course, that's assuming that market purchases are available for us to purchase, right? If we wouldn't have that, you take that to a dire situation or consequence, and you could have outages, right? You could be interrupting your customers. They wouldn't have the power that they would need.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too technical. When we were kind of working on this, you think about what a system needs to operate. And another thing I think that's a downfall of renewables is you can't exactly put a little bit more fuel on it. You can't step on the gas a little bit more and get more out of it. It's producing what it can. And so when the system needs to react to new load on the system, it can't respond. You have to have something that regulates and responds.
And I might contrast wind and solar with a coal plant. I think, Colin, you said capacity is the potential. And when you have 1 to 2 months of coal on a coal pile right next to the plant, it has that ability to lean on that coal pile and draw from it when needed. So it always has that potential, or should always have that potential to generate.
And you mentioned, Colin, we got a diverse portfolio. Renewables, are part of that portfolio. We have access to some wind and solar and hydro. And so are there any benefits to having renewables other than low emissions?
Well, Andrew just hit on a big one. I mean, the cost impact of fuel is missing from the renewable space. We rely on wind, we rely on solar. We don't have the fuel costs associated. So that's probably the biggest benefit that stands out in my mind.
Yeah, and certainly within limits, it provides low-cost energy. There might be high cost to construct the facility, but once it's constructed, it's really zero-cost energy. So there is value to that.
So that makes sense. So whatever you can invest in, and you carry that cost through the time that the investment's there, it lowers cost potentially. And so it sounds to me like, renewables really address the energy side of that equation as we're talking about capacity and energy. It's really an ability to fix a cost of energy over time with those renewables. They do provide capacity and energy when the sun is shining, that's for sure, or where the wind is blowing. But because they aren't always available, they don't always help with the capacity side. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about earlier, we don't get the accreditation. You use the example of getting 10% credit for a given asset or resource. That's because that sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. So we have to be regulated to that end. I think that's a key component that they won't fulfill our capacity needs. It's not dispatchable. It's that dispatchable versus intermittent resource discussion that we have, right?
And I do want to throw in here just maybe your comments on batteries, because we haven't really talked about that. And I know we're going to have another segment to talk about new technologies or different technologies, but one would argue that I can store up energy in a battery. So why wouldn't that be a good solution?
And it is helpful, particularly in the summer. So the sun is shining the brightest at noon, and by the time we're peaking 5 to 6, the sun is starting to, be less. The solar energy would be generating less at that point in time. That's where batteries can kick in and provide value later in the day and allow for that additional value from the solar as you get into the evening peak. But even that has its limits. And then particularly in the winter, 4-hour batteries, which is typical for us right now, doesn't really help a lot, because during the winter, the higher loads stay throughout the day into the night, and the batteries just have limited value during those periods.
I know we're getting a little bit off cuff here, but what have you seen in the industry right now, and maybe highlight or foreshadowing what we're going to talk about with new technologies? What has been the typical duration of battery storage that you've seen either on the market, in the systems that are out there?
I don't know if I can speak to the numbers real well, but it's been fairly small. And I think I mentioned in our previous conversation that the sizing of the batteries just really isn't there to make a deep, large impact and solve some of those issues that Andrew just described.
You mentioned the 4 hours. I've kind of heard that as the target. I know I was at a conference earlier last year with one of the largest battery plants in the United States, which is out in California, and it's 4 hours. And the reality is that's not a lot of time. And I mean, you can think about that. Even if I pulled out my iPhone, it's got a limited capacity. It doesn't run all the time, especially with heavy usage. So, I think as we look at this capacity, again, with our whole connotation of its potential, but it's the potential over time. And so there are times when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, batteries only last for a certain period of time. And so we have to have something that we can depend on. Given our discussion, here's what I understand. So make sure I can wrap this up and make sure I understood what we've got. We need dispatchable resources such as coal and natural gas so that we can meet our electricity demand, that capacity, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We also want renewable resources. So there are some benefits of renewables such as wind and solar and hydro to not only lower our air emissions, but they can also support our energy usage and potentially lower our energy costs over time. Because like you say, a fixed cost investment. And then bottom line, those dispatchable resources, the coal and the natural gas in particular, they help with that capacity, but the intermittent resources don't. And the markets, which we'll talk about in another segment as well, recognize that fact that we can't count on that capacity. Both dispatchable and intermittent resources are good. They're just not created equal, right? Okay. So any other thoughts from you guys on capacity and energy or intermittent resources versus dispatchable resources as we kind of wrap things up today?
A diverse resource mix is really what we need. That's what we've been advertising, and it just ends up being the lowest cost, most reliable option for us.
And you essentially said it, Jonathan, just said it in a different way. 1 megawatt of capacity from a fossil fired generation facility is not equivalent to a megawatt of capacity from a renewable resource, right? And so I think that's the key component and takeaway from most of the discussion here.
Yeah, it's hard to get a megawatt out of that solar plant at midnight.
That's right.
Now
That's right. That's right.
Well, Colin, Andrew, thank you for your time today.
You bet. Thanks.